We don't want to do something to make our speakers mad. Mr. Blackshear, I'm blank here, is an adjunct history professor at the University of North Texas, Dallas. He has written 3 books, and one of them caught our eye. We now have it at the museum, partly because the history of the Texas Panhandle and the New Mexico impacts our history quite a bit. So one of the books that he had written in particular is about the soldiers and Comancheros in the Canadian River Valley. And so we asked him to talk about it. So without further ado, I'll give you James Blackshear.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody coming. I'm going to try to get this, whoops, I got to share this, get this to come up correctly. And I'll have a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation as I go through this, hopefully. Okay, I appreciate everybody coming. I know you could be doing other things, so it's always great to talk to people that are also interested in history. And certainly you guys have a lot of history of your own up there in the Oklahoma Panhandle. I'm going to mainly talk about the soldiers, the Comancheros, and the Indians that are related to a little known fort called Fort Bascom, which was about 60 miles east of the Texas border in the Texas Panhandle. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about other books besides the one on Fort Bascom, although that's the main gist of the subject matter we'll go through. Again, I want to thank you to the Historical Society there for asking me to speak on Fort Bascom. I wrote this book, Fort Bascom, Soldiers, Comancheros, and Indians in the Canadian River Valley. Back in 2015, it was published by the University of Oklahoma Press. And then actually in 2013, I had an earlier book, but this one came along, Confederates and Comancheros, this past September. It's also from the University of Oklahoma Press, and it was co-written by Glenn Sample Ely. He focused more on the Texas part of the Texas-New Mexico borderlands, and I focused more on the New Mexico part of those borderlands. But again, even before those 2 books, I had a book on San Miguel County, the history of San Miguel County, and what was going on there in New Mexico in the 1890s called Honor and Defiance, where it also, to a certain extent, really captured my interest in regards to these Hispano ranchers and farmers who were also Comancheros. So there's a common thread through all the books. Certainly, the main focus of the talk tonight is about Fort Bascom, and its really pretty significant impact on gaining control of the Southern Plains Indians, which would certainly impact your own history there around Goodwell. But okay, maybe you've heard of Fort Bascom, probably not, but you're closer to that region north of Tucumcari, so maybe you have. But why did I become interested in this fort? My wife and I, we have a cabin. Luckily, we still have a cabin in San Miguel County, just north of Las Vegas, New Mexico. At present, there's a 312,000 acre fire that blew through our community back on April 22nd. Pretty much all of the houses around us are gone, except ours. But we've owned this property since 1999, and we began to build. And coming from North Texas, we live in Mesquite. I teach at University of North Texas. I've taught at Collin College and the University of North Texas in Denton. We've always had this property, and we always go to New Mexico every summer, or we used to. Now I'm basically retired, and I teach part-time at University of North Texas in Dallas. So we would go 287 up through Decatur to Wichita Falls, through Amarillo to 40. And a shortcut to Las Vegas, New Mexico was right there in Tucumcari off of a little road called 105. You get about 11 miles north of Tucumcari on 105 out in the middle of nowhere. It's about 100 miles to Las Vegas. You see this sign. I saw this sign, Fort Bascom. Fort Bascom was built to protect this area from Comanches, this sign says. In 1864, Kit Carson led a campaign against the Comanches, as did General Philip Sheridan in 1868. The fort was also established to control the Comancheros, the Mexicans involved in the illegal trade with the Comanches. Fort Bascom was abandoned in 1870. Well, not quite. Although it was officially closed in 1870, what my research would find out later was that that was not the case. They would reopen that fort every summer through 1874, and it would operate all summer long because the Comanches were still there, the Kiowa were still there. And where were they? They were in the Texas Panhandle, and they were in the Oklahoma Panhandle as well. So they would conduct operations out of Fort Bascom after it officially closed. So my wife and I would stop at this sign, look around, looking for some ruins, something. There's absolutely nothing there. The actual fort, there's really no remnants of it there anymore. Was actually bulldozed some time ago, somebody looking for trinkets or whatever. It's a few miles away from this road. But again, so this is the basic history that I first found out about probably around, I don't know, 2004, 2005. And I began to research Fort Bascom. Las Vegas, New Mexico has an excellent library with a lot of primary sources related to all forts in New Mexico. So I began to gain access to a lot of history related to this fort, and it seemed to be very interesting. So as it states, the fort was established to control the Comancheros and also to stop the Comanches. So on one point, it's almost like a John Wayne movie. On another point, we drove through there one time, and this was the original sign that was there. Same verbiage, Fort Bascom, 1860, but there's a few bullet holes there. And somebody has taken a knife or something and they've scratched into this metal sign out in the middle of nowhere. Carson and Sheridan equals, pardon my language, assholes. And beneath that to the right, Fort Bascom, 1863 to 1870, Indian land. So there's certainly a lot more going on with this history than just the fact that there were some soldiers posted out there to gain control of the Southern Plains Indians. And that's what my book on Fort Bascom really gets into. It's a lot of social history. It's a lot about the various people that inhabited the fort, including women who followed their husbands, or they lived outside of the post in little villages. It's also about the local citizens from Las Vegas and surrounding communities that began to do business with the fort. And it's also about the Comanches and the Kiowa and the Navajo, who were also nearby. So if you look at a Google map of where Fort Bascom is, and you may be more well versed in this fort, I'm not sure, but most folks, when I give this talk or a talk similar to it, have never heard of Fort Bascom, like I had never heard of it. But this is a Google map. Here's the Canadian River, and there's this huge bend. And again, we're about 60 miles west of the Texas border here, and 10 miles, 11 miles north of Tucumcari, New Mexico. And where this star is where the fort was posted. Now I'm gonna zoom in on this just a little bit, and you can actually you can see a footprint. I'm going to show you some little red arrows there. Those are the outlines of where the footers were for the actual post. So yeah, this little known fort that whatever happened there, nobody really knows about. No movies are ever made about it. John Wayne never rode through there, but there's the actual evidence that there was a fort not far from the Texas border. We're going to get into a little bit on why it was so close to the Texas border in a minute. But first, there's the footprint of Fort Bascom. And here is Fort Bascom. When I was doing the research for the book and I was conversing with the University of Oklahoma Press, where it was published, we decided it would probably be best if I went to Washington, D.C. and looked through the archives and correlated a lot of the primary source information that I was getting in Las Vegas with the actual documents in the National Archives. So I did that. And on a day trip to Maryland, where they store maps and drawings, I found this in a little manila folder from 1865. And this is an actual drawing, I think, from one of the captains that led the post, but I'm not sure. His name was scrawled on the back of this actual drawing. So here is the actual fort, Fort Bascom, as it looked in 1865, just a couple of years after it was commissioned, actually about a year and a half. So a pretty significant base of operations, very close to the Texas border. Why was it significant? Why do I think it was significant? How could I find information to write a book about? Fort Bascom was a place where soldiers from all over the United States were stationed during the Civil War and after the Civil War. The 7th U.S. Infantry and the 1st New Mexico Volunteer Cavalry were the first company units to come to Fort Bascom and actually to help build it. Because again, it was during the Civil War in the summer and there weren't a lot of laborers around. So soldiers became laborers. And frankly, their adobe making skills were not the best. And one of the chronic complaints from soldiers throughout the history of Fort Bascom is how it was almost uninhabitable at certain points with leaky roofs and things like that. These are the first two companies that came there in 1863 during the Civil War. Later, the 8th U.S. Cavalry would be stationed there, as well as the 3rd Cavalry. Spent a lot of time at Fort Bascom. And also Buffalo soldiers. After the Civil War, African-American units were sent west. The 57th and 125th United States Colored Infantry were stationed throughout the West, as you may know, and certainly they were at Fort Bascom. Later, they will be formed into the 9th and 10th Cavalry. So a variety of different people, Hispanos, Irishmen, Germans, Anglo-Americans, African-Americans, and many United Nations. Everybody served at this distant post, as they did in other frontier posts, particularly in New Mexico and the 37th U.S. Infantry. Again, why do I think it was so significant? Well, there's a lot of history involved with Fort Bascom that goes back to a history of the West, a history of the Civil War, a history of frontier soldiers. And certainly one of the major figures related to Fort Bascom, I'd never heard of him, so maybe you hadn't either, was Edward H. Bergman, who was a captain, one of the first officers to go to Fort Bascom. But that's not what I'm getting at. Now, here's the commanding general of the Department of New Mexico during the Civil War and the District of New Mexico after the war, General James H. Carleton, who was stationed in Santa Fe. And in the center here is Colonel Kit Carson. Kit Carson was the key person in a lot of the history of Fort Bascom. He was a huge friend of Edward H. Bergman, Major Bergman's. They fought together during the Civil War. And afterward, Carson will help Bergman get his elevation to major within the United States Army. It'll be James H. Carleton who asked Bergman to go down to the Canadian River and look for a place to build a base. There had already been a camp called Camp Easton at the junction of Ute River and the Canadian River. And it was there kind of as a lookout post to look for Confederates. There had already been one major invasion of Texas Confederates into New Mexico during the Civil War in 1862, and it had been stopped at a place called Glorieta Pass. Prior to getting to Glorieta Pass, there had been a major battle at Fort Craig along the Rio Grande River, and Carson was there, Bergman was there, and James H. Carleton, the commanding general, was not there yet. He was on his way from California. He led a contingent called the California Column into New Mexico, and many soldiers from the California Column will be stationed at Fort Bascom later. But Carleton wasn't involved in that major battle at Glorieta Pass. He comes to know Kit Carson, relies on him, and it's going to be Carson who's going to pick Bergman for a lot of key appointments. Carson will also play a huge role on a major expedition out of Fort Bascom that I'll get to in a minute. So why Fort Bascom? George N. Bascom was a lieutenant in the 7th U.S. Infantry, and he was killed at the Battle of Val Verde during the Civil War. Again, Carleton was there, Bergman was there. Many of the soldiers that were served at Fort Bascom were there. Bergman is ordered to go to the Canadian River to find a place for a permanent stationary fort, not a camp. And once they find that place where they're going to build a fort and it begins to be commissioned, they will turn it over, and the first commander will not be Bergman. It'll be a regular Army captain from the 7th Infantry. Bergman was a New Mexico volunteer. He was from Prussia. He knew the lay of the land. That's why Carleton had picked him to find a spot for the fort. But when it came time to pick a commander, he picked a regular Army captain by the name of George Plimpton, who brought in the 7th company of 7th Infantry. Bergman brought in a company of New Mexico Volunteer Cavalry, and they named that fort for George N. Bascom, who was also of the 7th Infantry. That's where you get the name Bascom. You may know Bascom from other frontier history or Western history. In 1860, before the Civil War, he was involved in what was called actually the Bascom Affair. When he was 25, Cochise in Arizona had been involved with some conflicts with local villages, and George N. Bascom, as a lieutenant, got involved in it, and some of Cochise's relatives were murdered after they were captured. And some of that blame goes to Bascom, which led to a 20-year Apache War. But after that conflict in 1860, Bascom is still serving, and he dies trying to save an artillery battery on the Rio Grande during the Battle of Val Verde. So they're not going to forget George N. Bascom, but that's where the name of the fort comes from. So why is it so significant? Why did I write a book about it? Well, you start looking at all the documents, and Fort Bascom is the point of the spear when it comes to gaining control of the Southern Plains Indians. Is that why it was built originally? Well, Carleton was very paranoid about Confederates launching another Confederate invasion first. We're talking about late 1863. Confederates had already come up the Rio Grande, captured Albuquerque, fought through Fort Craig, captured Santa Fe. Confederates were defeated in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. But Carleton was very worried that there would be another invasion, and there were a lot of rumors out there that the next one would come up the Canadian River and go west. And he wanted to place a fort along the Canadian River to act as a tripwire. And that's where the evolution or the creation of Fort Bascom came from. Shortly thereafter, though, it wasn't about a Confederate invasion. It was going to be more about gaining control of the Comanche and the Kiowa. Because again, You may or may not be able to see from this map. Here's Fort Bascom. Comancheria, the homeland of the Comanche Indians, is in the gray. The Llano Estacado is the cross-hatched area. It's very close to Fort Bascom. And who dominates this entire area, regardless of whether you're talking about the Confederates or the Union Army? It's the Comanches. They're very powerful, as you probably know, force in Texas, in the Oklahoma Panhandle, in New Mexico, all up and down the Canadian River Valley. They've got villages, and that's going to lead to some conflict. So what better place jump off and send off expeditions to go after the Comanches than Fort Bascom, because there's no major forts up here in the Texas Panhandle or anywhere else yet. In 1863, 1864, 1865. You can see from this legend all the different forts that will pop up all around. But here's Texas, here's Fort Bascom, you're 60 miles away. Now, back in the day in 1864, 60 miles was maybe like going to the moon as far as we're concerned. For them, you ride a horse for 10 days. If you don't have water, you got to turn around. And who knew where the water holes were? It wasn't maybe the Hispano, the New Mexican soldiers did to a certain extent, but when they're mustered out in 1866 and regular army takes over, you got soldiers from Kentucky and New Jersey and Alabama, and they do not know where the water holes are. And so there's a big learning curve, a transition that will occur after the Hispano soldiers are mustered out. But again, this is another reason there's just tons of information about this fort and the role it played in defeating the Comanches in the National Archives. And that's why I call it the point of the spear. But, the war's going to be over. The Civil War is going to be over in 1865. Certainly the Confederates were really cagey after they were defeated at the Battle of Glorieta Pass in 1862. And while they would have loved to reinvade New Mexico and get to Fort Union and try to get to those gold mines in Colorado, they just didn't have the wherewithal. They didn't have the men or the money or the ability to do it. But they sent out spies all over the place with false information that they were coming. And so Carleton was really caught up in that. General James H. Carleton in Santa Fe, the commander of New Mexico, for over a year and a half. And that was one of the first things that the soldiers at Fort Bascom were tasked with doing. But at the same time, there were a lot of Indian raids in and around, whoops, I went backwards somehow here. Indian raids in and around Las Vegas, New Mexico, Anton Chico, which is to the west. In 1864, Colonel Kit Carson was ordered by Carleton to go into Canyon de Chelly and defeat the Navajo. And where did they send the Navajo? 90 miles south of Fort Bascom to a new fort, Fort Sumner, with the Bosque Redondo Indian Reservation. You had Mesquillero Apaches subjugated and put at the Bosque Redondo Indian Reservation, and you had their hated enemy, the Navajo, put at this reservation. By 1868, there were 8,000 Navajo at the Bosque Redondo Indian Reservation. A lot of them didn't like it, as you can imagine. A lot of them were escaping. A lot of patrols from Fort Bascom were always to the west around this huge plateau or mesa called Mesa Rica, about 30 miles long and 20 miles wide, looking for Navajo who were hungry. As they were trying to get back to their homeland, they would rob local ranchers of sheep. There would be violence, there would be death. So you've got the Comanches, you've got the Kiowa, who know the United States Army is split and distracted, and you've got subjugated Navajo trying to escape and get back to their homeland. There's a lot on these soldiers in the middle of nowhere at Fort Bascom, their duties. And you take 10 or 20 troopers on a 25 to 30 day patrol. And again, that's You got to know where the water holes are. You got to know where you can get forage, particularly in winter, or you're going to be dead. So it's very challenging. In the midst of that, there's this age-old economy that the soldiers at Fort Bascom are going to have to deal with. Hispano farmers and ranchers, the Comancheros, who had been trading with Plains Indians for over a century, 150 years. So at this point, in the late 1850s and into the Civil War, Comanches are raiding all through North Texas and Northwest Texas, Texas cattle ranchers. And again, during the Civil War, there's not a lot of firepower that the frontier Texas patrols can put together, or their militias. And so tens of thousands of cattle are being stolen by the Comanches. Comanches become herders. They take them to a couple of trading points. One is Kittikay up around Vernon, Texas. Another is closer to Lubbock, Muchikay. And there would be these trading fairs with Hispano Comancheros in Texas. So you've got one up around Vernon and one down around Lubbock. But here's just kind of a general idea of what's going on. These are cattle going west and northwest. They go into New Mexico. They trade for the things, and I'm going to get into that in a minute, that the Comanches need to survive. And then the cattle are re-brokered into the rest of the United States. It's a black market economy between mountain people and plains people that thrives through the 1860s and 1870s into the mid 1870s, when the Comanches are finally placed on reservations, and that's going to kind of dry up the market for the Comancheros. I'm also going to talk just a little bit about these third-party brokers in New Mexico territory. So you got regular everyday people that have a few horses, a little bit of corn. They live out, on the land grant in Las Vegas. Once or twice a year, they'll do a 200 or 300 mile round trip to Kittikay or Muchikay, and they'll trade with their cousins, the Comanches. Because as far back as the 1600s, there's a lot of raiding and trading going on between Spanish, New Spain, Mexico when it's independent, and the Comanches, who were always there. And these raiding and trading societies develop. They have kinship ties, where someone that had been in a Mexican village is raised in a Comanche village. Someone that was in a Comanche village in a revenge raid is taken a child and is raised as a servant in the New Mexican villages. And when they all grow up, they speak a variety of different languages, and they become excellent interpreters and traders. So Fort Bascom is going to have a huge role to play in trying to stop this trade. Now, when I talk about Comancheros, you could say mountain men. Certainly they live either in the mountains or in mountain valleys, all up and down the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Now, when I think of mountain men, I might think of Robert Redford in Jeremiah Johnson. It's a very popular movie. Maybe some of you might have seen it back, I believe, in the late 60s or early 70s. These heroic figures who leave, quote unquote, civilization, go out, they mingle and even marry into native societies. They trade with native societies, and then they bring those goods back to the East Coast. One of those mountain people has been on a pedestal, all of our lives. Kit Carson. That's where he made his name, right? Kit Carson, Serene, St. Vrain, a lot of them as mountain men trading with Native Americans, culturally assimilating with the majority population. That might be a conception, certainly, that I had, maybe you had, of what a mountain man was. Now, as far as these Comancheros, what was Americans, contemporary and folks of today's perception of what a Comanchero was? Well, there was a movie about the Comancheros. Big John Wayne, this old, remember when you used to go to the movies and there'd be a placard on the wall? Big John Wayne, the Comancheros. Over on the right, it says, "These were the reckless who trespassed the borders of no return into the kingdom of the killers, known as the Comancheros. The Comancheros were the bad guys. They were the ne'er-do-wells. They were trading in whiskey and people, and they were these, almost subhuman type people, thieves, vagabonds. Those were those mountain people, not the Kit Carsons of the world. That's what the perception was, not only Comancheros, but most Hispanos who lived in New Mexico, right? But that's not who the Comancheros were. This is who the Comancheros were. They were, again, mountain people. They lived in Mora, Las Vegas, Anton Chico, Chaparrito. They lived along river basins, either the Pecos, the Gallinas, La Cuesta. And most of the year they were just, ranchers and farmers. But it was a tradition. A lot of the fathers and their sons, if they were of age, would pack up a bunch of wagons and head off to Texas from La Cuesta. Take them 5 weeks to get there. They would trade for, you guessed it, cattle and come back. Those are the folks that the soldiers at Fort Bascom are going to have to begin to round up to stop the trade, as well as trying to subjugate and defeat the Comanches, who are bringing the trade goods to these Comancheros. So the mountain people and the plains people, been there forever. Antelope focused people, right? They'd look west, and they would trade with the mountain people, not the Comanches at that time, but the Puebloan-speaking peoples. Puebloan-speaking peoples, as you probably know, were in West Texas, and they were in Oklahoma Panhandle. There was these connections, these lines. Santa Fe Trail, yeah, that was something that really got popular once Mexico became an independent nation, and they wanted to do business with the United States. But there were trails connecting peoples long before the Santa Fe Trail. Let's say 1540s, probably somewhere around where I-40 is today, because those were the trails that the United States used. They were already in place when they gained control of the West after the Mexican War. So who was there during this period in the Canadian River Valley, let's say, when Fort Bascom was erected? Mainly the Comanche, but also the Kiowa. Some of the most significant figures that will deal with soldiers and post commanders at Fort Bascom are Chief Maui, a huge figure in the history of the Comanches, not only in Texas, but he was hanging around in Oklahoma a little bit as well as Tin Bears, very significant figure in the history of the Southwest, and Prick in the Forehead. And again, they as you know, they hunted the bison. They lived in the Red River Valley. They lived in the Canadian River Valley. They were ensconced there. We're talking Comancheria. You may have heard of the Comanche Empire, the really popular book by Pekka Hamalainen, where, the most powerful nation in North America, he argues, in the early 19th century, it wasn't the French, and it wasn't the United States, and it wasn't the Spanish, it was the Comanches. And you had to learn their language. And certainly when you get to the 1860s, they have been debilitated by disease, by encroachment, by armies, but they're still a significant figure out there. They're so significant that there will be no settlement west of I-35 in Texas until after the 1870s. Why? These guys are why. That was their land, as that sign stated, that Fort Bascom sign. It wasn't anybody else's land. They were going to fight for it, and they certainly did. Now, how did that Comanchero trade continue to support the Comanches into the 1870s? Well, there were plenty of very wealthy Anglo, Hispano, and even German immigrant-speaking merchants who lived in Las Vegas and Santa Fe, willing to trade, willing to send their Hispano rancher and farmer middlemen to Texas with the stuff the Comanches needed to survive. Whether we're talking textiles, whether we're talking food, we're certainly talking rifles and ammunition and also whiskey. Now, rifles, ammunition and whiskey, that was illegal. You could go to Santa Fe in the 1850s, 60s, 70s and apply for a license, just any kind of business license, to go to what was called the Comanche country, which was Texas, and trade. Persons like Zadok Staub or Lyman Spiegelberg or Bernard Seligman, these wholesalers, major, they got connections in New York City. They would get their licenses. It'll get a stamp on it. They will sign it. The superintendent of Indian Affairs will sign it. They will tell who's going to go to the Comanche country. They will tell what they're going to take to trade. They will never tell what they're trading for. And there are hundreds of these licenses in the archives. Who was fueling the Comanchero trade? It was these merchants. Now, up until recently, we knew that was the case, but we didn't have a lot of the names. With Glenn and myself, our latest book, Confederates and Comancheros, I detail all that. But certainly I also talk about it in the Fort Bascom book. So they're giving the goods to the Comancheros who are going to take this stuff west to trade. And they were so proud of the fact that they also were government contractors. What were they? I wonder what they were selling to the government. So these Comancheros who lived in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of New Mexico, who would go to the Comanche country for these merchants. I'm just going to show you a few. These red lines are just the trails that they used. So, and you may not be able to see it, but here's Palo Duro, Cold Spring, Camp Nichols, Lower Cimarron Spring. You guys know more about all this area than I do. Bent's New Fort, Bent's Old Fort, the mountain route of the Santa Fe Trail, the Canadian River. Here's one of the major routes. It'll go all the way up to Taos and go all the way up down the Canadian River. Merchants, Comancheros, and they will trade with the Comanches. It's the same with a lot of, going to the Gallinas River, going down the Pecos River, and they'll branch off. This is eerily similar to interstate between Fort Sumner and Lubbock, Texas. And there's a reason for that. Moochcase down here. Moochcay Peak, that was one of the major trading centers between Comancheros and Comanches. And they would go all the way down the Pecos River into Mexico as well. So that just kind of gives you kind of a flavor of how big this Comanchero trade was. And here's Fort Bascom right here. I told you a little earlier that Ute Creek was where they first had a little camp. Soldiers camped out there looking for an invasion from the Confederates coming to the west. But Fort Bascom is going to be there for 11 years. And as the Civil War wanes down, it's the Comanchero trade. It's subjugating the Comanches that will become the main mission of those soldiers stationed at Fort Bascom. Again, so I know I've already given it away. These merchants are giving the Comancheros a lot of stuff the Comanches wanted. Here's an actual report from 1867 from a Sergeant Brown. What did he apprehend these Comancheros coming back from Texas? Although no, going to Texas. 11 pack mules. They're carrying 200 pounds of corn, 500 pounds of Mexican hard bread. That's something they made in these what are called hornos, those little beehive ovens. So you can make two little cakes of that Mexican hard bread in a horno oven in a couple, 2 or 3 hours. So it's going to take a lot of work and effort to come up with 500 pounds of Mexican hard bread. 35 or 40 butcher knives, 9 files, vermilion. That's the canary in the coal mine. When you find a Comanchero or a trader with vermilion, you know he's trading with the Comanches or with the Indians, because they love that vermilion, that dye, that red dye. Again, some of them had legal licenses. A lot of them did, and they weren't supposed to be carrying weapons with them. But a lot of them were. So in the licenses, you never see documents that say we're going to sell them percussion caps or rifles. That's always in the military documents, not in the licenses or the applications for licenses. white flannel, tea, sugar, flour. They're carrying all this to the Comanche country, or otherwise Texas. That's in 1867. Here's another report in 1870. 8th Cavalry apprehended Comancheros heading east with 23 pack mules, carrying about 2.5 tons of powder, lead, cloth, trinkets, and fancy articles. So again, what are they trading for? Cattle. Hundreds of thousands of cattle coming out of Texas. Sometimes Comanches are herding them to a certain point, and then the Comancheros herd them. Sometimes, particularly after the Civil War, but even while the Civil War was going on, there's such a huge demand for cattle. Cattle is the driving force behind the economy in New Mexico. You got all these forts, you got to feed all these soldiers, but you also got to feed the Navajo and the incarcerated Indians like the Comancheros. What are you feeding them? You're feeding them beef if you can get it. One of the government contractors for the Union Army during the Civil War, his name was James Patterson, and he operated out of Fort Sumner. And occasionally, old James Patterson, during the Civil War, he would go down into Texas, and he did some contracts with a man by the name of John Chisholm, who you may or may not have heard of, during the Civil War for Texas cattle. And he would herd them back to Fort Sumner to feed not only the Navajo Indians, but the Union Army. Why would John Chisholm do that? Well, after the fall of Vicksburg, there's not a real good way to get cattle, Texas cattle, to the Confederacy in the East, which had helped to supply the Confederacy throughout the Civil War. Also, Confederate money is becoming worthless after 1863, 1864. John Chisholm and a lot of other Texas cattlemen are looking to make a buck, and they'll do it with James Patterson out of Fort Sumner. Later, James Patterson, this entrepreneur, will sell corn and forage and lumber and a million other things to Fort Bascom as it's being built and as it's being supplied. So Patterson's in a little bit of everything, but certainly cattle is the key item in this black market economy. In 1872 and 1873, $44 million in stolen horses and cattle were submitted to Indian depredation claims in Texas alone. Now, it's like anything else. It's an insurance claim. You got to go to the government. There'll be court fights. That money will come out of money set aside for Indians on reservations. So, there's trials going on. Eventually, about $11 million of that will go to those Texas cattlemen out of that $44 million that they said was related to the amount of cattle that they lost just in 2 years. So what was it from 1860 to 1875? I don't know. You can see just how important cattle was to the economy of the Southwest. So who's going to be trying to stop this Comanchero trade? This is a photo from 1875. This is what a soldier at Fort Bascom would have looked like, or any of these frontier forts. They were construction supervisors. They were herders. Once they began to interdict and stop the Comancheros who were coming back to New Mexico with the cattle, what are they going to do with the cattle? A lot of times they're going to take it to Fort Bascom, and there'll be hundreds, thousands of cattle being taken care of by soldiers around Fort Bascom, to such a degree that they're complaining to Carlton and their other supervisors about, we're soldiers. We don't know anything about herding cattle. What do you want us to do with them? At one point, one of the commanders says, well, it's contraband, kill them. So they do. And there's an immediate order sent back out. Stop that. Don't do that. They will arrest Comancheros. It will go to local grand juries in New Mexico. And most of these Hispanos will get off because they had bills of sale that they got from somewhere, from the Comanches. I bought these cattle fair and square. And the judges in New Mexico, well, they've got a receipt They would let them go, or they would just hold the cattle in New Mexico until everything is resolved, and that might be 6 months or a year later. And by then, there's just no way they're going to ever get their cattle back. So there's a lot of frustrated, certainly Texans and soldiers, because of what's going on in New Mexico to try to slow down the end of this black market cattle trade. Some of the soldiers at Fort Bascom and elsewhere see that it's such a profitable enterprise to get involved with the Comanches cattle that they set up their own shops in New Mexico after they muster out of the Army. A couple in particular, a captain by the name of Patrick Healy, another by the name of Charles T. Jennings, set up at a place called Hatch's Ranch on the Gallinas River between Anton Chico and Fort Bascom. And they go to Washington, D.C., and they get all licenses stopped for the Comancheros. And they're the only ones that can deal with the Comanches, and they're going to do it legal, and they'll never trade weapons to them, and they're going to clean that whole mess up. It's all going to be great, except it never is. The Comancheros just quit getting, if they're not going to get legal licenses, they just did it anyway. And they kind of starved Healy and Jennings out of the business. They ended up having to quit. And the Comanchero trade and stolen cattle just got worse. But there's a lot in the Fort Bascom book about that entire episode. But these guys, they really had their hands full out there in the middle of nowhere. They're going to be involved, and I cover it, hundreds of scouts and patrols out of Fort Bascom, again, 11 miles north of Tucumcari. And this is a photo towards where Fort Bascom would be. It's, kind of a hellish looking country. And you're going to go on a scout, you're going to go for 10 days or 20 days or maybe 30 days. If you're just, a soldier posted to Fort Bascom. You're going to go around Mesa Rica. Again, that's this major mesa about 10 miles from Fort Bascom, about 30 miles long and 10 miles wide. You're going to actually take patrols all the way down to the Bosque Redondo, about 90 miles away. You're looking for the Navajo. You're Anton Chico to the west, which is on an old ancient trail that goes all the way to Albuquerque. Anton Chico is actually a part of the old Fort Smith Road that comes, I-40, and it would pass the Canadian River at Fort Bascom, go to a place called Concha Springs over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, cross over, go to Anton Chico, very famous for that 1842 Texas expedition to go to Mexico and claim it as a part of the Republic of Texas. And they were all incarcerated at Anton Chico. And that road, that old Fort Smith Road, would go all the way to Albuquerque. Upper Cimarron Spring Scouts, Bergman posted to Upper Cimarron Spring, Captain Bergman from Fort Bascom, when there's just tons of raids in late 1863, 1864 along the Santa Fe Trail up there. Scouts even to the Texas Panhandle and into West Texas. I'm going to detail, I know I'll probably go on too long, but I'm going to detail like 3 major expeditions to give you a general idea of the logistics involved coming out of Fort Bascom and why it was so important. The first one, as I've talked about just barely a little bit, was in 1864. It's called the Battle of Adobe Walls. Sometimes it's called the First Battle of Adobe Walls. Adobe Walls was an old trading post that Charles Bent and Ceron St. Vrain built north of, around Borger, that general area, not far from you guys, straight north of Amarillo, an old adobe trading post that had been abandoned. Because of all of the raids along the Santa Fe Trail, and most of the Indians, at least this is what that's what Carleton, the commander in New Mexico, thinks during the Civil War, that to get a handle on the raids on the Santa Fe Trail, you got to go to the Canadian River Valley, you got to go north of what we now know of Amarillo, and you've got to attack the Comanche and the Kiowa where they are. So Colonel Kit Carson will lead several infantry units from Fort Bascom and Sumner and Union. They'll all meet at Fort Bascom. They will get their supplies there, as well as some California column companies. They will go too. They will all leave Fort Bascom and go up the Canadian River. To give you a general idea, you never really hear much about this, but if you just think about it for a minute, 27 supply wagons, a herd of cattle, 321 soldiers, 14 officers, 72 Utes. They got some Utes from the Cimarron Indian Reservation to come down because they hate the Comanches, to participate in a raid on a Comanche village, as well as some Apache scouts. That's one major expedition that started in late November of 1864, and Carson almost ended up like Custer. If not for a couple of mountain howitzers that they took with them, they were almost completely surrounded where Adobe Walls is. And if not for those howitzers, they would have probably been engulfed and destroyed. They participated in a retreat all the way back into New Mexico from the Texas border. So it was almost a disaster, and they painted over it and said it was a success because they burned a Kiowa village, but that's not really what happened. In 1868, from Fort Bascom, another major expedition, a part of what was called Sheridan's Winter Campaign. Same kind of general idea that Carleton wanted Carson to do in 1864. Go after the Comanche and the Kiowa in their stronghold in the Canadian River Valley, along the Red River. A Major Andrew Evans will lead the campaign from Bascom. He was from Fort Stanton, but soldiers from Fort Union will participate. You got the 37th Infantry, the 3rd Cav, the 47 supply wagons, 3 ambulances, 93,000 pounds of corn, 64,000 pounds. This is what they started with. They will be sending back empty wagons for more supplies. 329 horses, 27 mules, 20 packers. If you didn't have a good packer, one experienced soldier once said, you're not going to survive in the Llano Estacado or in the road plains of New Mexico if your stuff isn't packed. 72 civilians, they're the ones, a lot of them are driving these wagons. Truth be told, a lot of them are probably Comancheros who use those same wagons to go to the Comanche country when the Army didn't hire them. 442 soldiers, 10 officers, 300 beef cattle. That's to feed the soldiers on this, 200-mile trek into the Comanche country. At one point, there's a snowstorm. They lose half their cattle. A lot of their horses are going to just die. These are very difficult experiences all these soldiers go through from Fort Bascom. That's just one prong of an attack during Sheridan's winter campaign. I'm not going to get into other parts of it. I just want to highlight, here is Fort Bascom again, a jump off point to try to gain control of the Southern Plains. And the last one is after supposedly Fort Bascom has closed, as that sign said, in 1870. Again, every summer after that, there was always a company or two at Fort Bascom or camped outside of Fort Bascom, and they would go on patrols. In 1874, as the Red River War begins, the one with Colonel Ronald McKenzie in it and several other major officers of the United States Army, Major William Redwood Price will lead 225 8th Cav troopers, 20 mule-drawn wagons by the Army with stuff, 20 mule-drawn wagons by contractors, 30 pack mules, and forage for animals. And he will, he's going down the Canadian River. So one of the interesting things you see in the documents is when Andrew Evans, Major Evans, goes up the Canadian River to defeat the Comanches in 1868, he takes along Colonel Kit Carson's report with him because he's following the same routes. Now they're going to diverge once they get into Texas Panhandle some. Major William Redwood Price does the same thing, except he telegraphs for Colonel Carson's report. And on both the 1868 expedition and the 1874 expedition, which also leaves from Fort Bascom, they're hauling those same mountain howitzers with them into battle. that Carson took with him. So a variety, hundreds of patrols, things we can't get into, we don't have time. But here are 3 major expeditions that left from Fort Bascom and played a significant role, particularly in 1874, of gaining control of the Southern Plains. And I show that in a map in the book that just shows, here's Fort Bascom, here's some of the major expeditions and patrols out of Fort Bascom. Edward Bergman, Captain Bergman, who was a post commander, he went up to the upper Cimarron Spring in 1864. Carson's expedition, Major Andrew W. Evans, approximately 275 miles. Major Price's, approximately 275 miles. There's others, 180 miles, 280 miles, and you're talking on a horse in that country that those photos that you're familiar with. If you don't know where the water holes are, and they're beginning to learn where the water holes are by 1874, right? You're going to die. You're going to walk back. Major Evans, a lot of his soldiers, over 100 of them, had to walk back to Fort Bascom because their horses were dead. They didn't know where the water was in 1868. So a lot of tough times. Now, I just threw this map in there today. Kind of gives you a better idea. This is a military map from 1870s. I thought you might be interested. Here is Camp Nichols. This thing would go away. I don't know what happened. There's Goodwill. There's Camp Nichols. Adobe Walls is here. This is actually a drawn map from 1870, but I've put in this other stuff. Here was Evans' route in blue in 1868. It goes into Texas Panhandle, goes into Oklahoma. It's going around all the place. He's going to get into a battle around Antelope Hills. Price is going to get into a battle with Lone Wolf in the Kiowa, in the same general area around Sweetwater Creek. But you've got, they're noting Comanches, they're noting Kiowa, they're noting the Jicarilla Apaches, who are a pretty significant force, but more in the 1850s and 1860s than they were in the 1870s. They're pretty much gone. The Kiowa Indians they're noting up here. But again, here's Fort Bascom. But again, the Canadian River, it's playing a huge role in what's going on in the history of the Southwest. Why? Because that's where there was water, right? If you're going to make a road, you're not going to make it out in the middle of the desert. If you do, you're not going to live long, unless maybe you're a Comanche or Kiowa or Comanchero and you know where the water holes are. One time, in an Indian deprecation claim, Charles Goodnight, who you've heard of, the famous cattleman, he claimed that hundreds of thousands of his cattle were stolen by the Comanches, and he would haul his cattle. He had herd his cattle up Fort Sumner, up the Rio Grande and the Pecos River, mainly the Pecos River, to Fort Sumner and sell them to the Army. And a lot of times he would, after he'd go to Fort Sumner, he'd go to Colorado. And he eventually ended up moving to Colorado. And in the depredation hearing, he was asked, well, why do you go that way? Why do you go west, go up the Pecos River, and then turn east after you get to New Mexico? Why don't you just cut across, like, let's say 284? Why don't you go that way? That's the shortest route. That's where the Comancheros go. And he says, well, I'd be killed. Comancheros, they're doing deals with the Comanches. Goodnight could not do that. So there's a lot, around Muchike and Kittikay. There's a lot going on with the Comanches as far as being able to be a viable force and not be forced to go to the reservation. Quanah was involved in some of that in 1874 and 1875. It kept them off the reservation. These Hispano farmers and ranchers are just out to make a buck. And if some rich merchant in Santa Fe wants to fill my wagon with stuff, and when I come back, I get to keep, some of those cattle or some of those goods, well, we'll do that. We got legal licenses, and there's so much confusion. Sometimes a captain at a post could give a pass to go trade. There's legal licenses, there's illegal goods, and if you're out and around Anton Chico on a little farm, and maybe you only speak Spanish, you probably don't know the difference. You've got a wagon and you trade, and why am I being stopped? This is going to go on again, and Fort Bascom will be involved in putting an end to the trade. Once the Quahati Comanches and the Kiowa were eventually defeated, late 1874, 1875. And that's when, they will not use Fort Bascom anymore. But again, it's significant. This is a photo from the early 20th century. Certainly, there's nothing there now, like I told you, and you saw the Google map. The cumulative knowledge gained, the learning curve from Fort Bascom scouts, patrols, and expeditions was assimilated throughout the Army. They found out where the water holes were. It had a lot to do with Colonel Ronald McKenzie and capturing a Comanchero and this Comanchero being forced to tell them where the water holes were. But it also had a lot to do with the Fort Bascom patrols in and around the Texas borderlands. So I've probably gone on too long, but I'm going to stop. And if you got any questions, I'm love to answer them. I appreciate y'all's attention.
I was wondering what the sheepmen, did they have anything to do with this trade coming up from Santa Fe? Or the
Did
Santa
who?
Fe Trail from Las Vegas?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear who you said.
The sheep herders coming from Las Vegas up
Yes.
the Santa Fe Trail, did they have anything to do with this trade?
Yes, they did. They did. A lot of the same folks that are doing business on the Santa Fe Trail trade, they're using those same wagons and those same wagoneers to go to Comancheria, to go to what they call the Comanche country to trade. All these licenses, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but yes, they did.
Okay.
A lot of the same seasoned persons on the wagons going to Santa Fe, they're Hispanic, they live in and around Santa Fe, all over the place, Las Vegas. They're going to Texas at different times as well. And they're being hired by these merchants in Santa Fe and Las Vegas to do it. Those merchants will say, well, this is the legal trade. I went to Santa Fe, I got a license, it's got a stamp on it, I paid a fee. I paid $1,000 to $2,000 bond, and if I do anything illegal, you could take that money from me. So yeah, I'm trading with the Comanches, but it's all legal stuff. It's for food and textiles. It's not whiskey and weapons. I don't do that. But they did. But I never found not one time where a bond was forfeited ever in the archives. They're all there. I'm going to just hold it up real quick and show you if I can find it. It's just an unbelievable thing that all these licenses are there, legal licenses to trade. And when you say legal, it means it's legal. You probably can't read any of that, but there's just about 10 pages of legal licenses to take goods, just legal goods, to Texas. But the other side of that equation is, what are they trading for? It's never mentioned. It's always stolen cattle. At one point, a lot of Texans will mount up a posse and come to New Mexico and take a lot of their cattle back. And they'll leave some dead Hispanos on their ranches when they do it. They retrieve thousands of cattle. They don't ever they're stuck by the court system. They don't get them back into Texas like they thought they would. But there's a lot of interesting things going on with this Comanchero trade. That's a great question. Does anybody else have one? I didn't get into it, but in the book, go ahead.
I don't know if you can hear me or not.
Give it a shot. I could hear that.
I went by the sign for the Battle of the Adobe Walls this morning. And how far away from the road is that sign from the actual battle site? Do you have any idea?
From the actual battle site, it's pretty close, because as I write about on this expedition, you got a panoply of different people, including the Utes, who hated the Comanches. And they're running, generally, you've got the infantry, you've got the cavalry, and in the front, you've got the Ute Indians with Carson. And they're way out in front of everybody else. And at one point, there's some scouts out, some Ute scouts out, and they come roaring back into the camp, and they tell Carson that they have found the Comanche village in the Kiowa village. It's a Kiowa village at first. And so, man, all of the Utes take off. They don't wait for anybody. They throw off it's very cold. There'd been a freeze the night before. They throw off their buffalo robes and they ride off into the horizon or into the morning sun to go after the Comanches. And the U.S. military cavalry is following them. Carson stays behind with the infantry and the mountain howitzers. And around 10 o'clock in the morning, they end up at Adobe Walls, the ruined fort, and they rest there. And out ahead of them, just a mile or two, they see a line of Comanches and Kiowa, and they go out for the fight. So it's very, very close, according to the records of some of the folks that were there. And I'm basing that on the fact that a lot of the horses and that the cavalry had brought stayed at the ruins of the Adobe Fort. And then they moved on out for the battle, which wasn't that far away. And then they got the howitzers out. They fired them a couple of times. The Comanches took off running. Carson says, okay, that's it. That's the way it usually happens. We're going to go back. We're going to burn this Kiowa village, and it's all going to be a success. And so they broke for lunch, and then all of a sudden they're almost surrounded, and all those Indians are back, and there's thousands of them. And they have to back out of there with those mountain howitzers. And for several grueling miles, they're just fighting all the way back to the infantry that they left about 10 miles back. So based on the records that I've seen, the first person accounts of the fight, they stopped at the Adobe Walls. They left some of their gear there and some of the cavalry's horses, and they moved out to fight. So it couldn't have been very far away.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Anybody
Thanks.
else? You bet. There's a book by a gentleman by the name of Alwyn Barr about he's an archaeologist and a historian, and he goes almost mile by mile on Carson's route with a lot of maps and stuff. And you might be interested in that book. Alwyn, Alwyn Barr, Barr, I believe is his name. Let me see if I got that book. I don't see it right there, but very fascinating. And he shows where all the campgrounds are from the spent cartridge shells and pieces of chain and different things from wagons that he finds wherever they camped along that route. But again, you've got all these other expeditions following the same route that Carson did, except archaeologists can, and historians can date the cartridges and different things they're finding.
Thank you.
You bet. Anybody else?
I guess not.
Okay, well,
Take care.
Thanks so much.
you bet. Hopefully you got something out of it, and go get it at the library or whatever, or maybe you can buy one. But love talking about Comancheros. So-
we have one account of Comancheros up in this region. I think it was Comancheros. Boss Neff, a local man, ran into a group of them and went hunting with them.
They were definitely around there. I focus on New Mexico, but they were all over the place, trading with, and certainly in the Texas or in the Oklahoma Panhandle, and in Oklahoma, Comanches and the Kiowa were there. Some of the details on some of the battles I talk about that, but they're going to go where the where the Comanches live a lot of times, or where they will have camps. And certainly they were on the Santa Fe Trail, they were in the Oklahoma Panhandle, they were all over Texas. It's almost unimaginable, that they're going to take a couple of mules or 15 mules or 3 wagons and 5 mules, and they're going to be gone for 8 weeks walking across that country. Sometimes they would, after they did a trade with the Comanches, as soon as they got out of sight, they would hide a lot of, they would hide some of their gear before they traded to make sure that the Comanches they were going to come into contact with weren't just going to rob them. Once they determined that, then they would bring the rest of their goods forward to trade for cattle. But yeah, but it's kind of funny. The Comanches were great cattlemen of other people's cattle. Sometimes they raise their own. Well, anybody else? I'm going to stop this share thing, I think. Let's see there. I'm willing to answer any question I can.
I think we're done with questions.
Okay. Well, I've got several pages on women at the fort as well that someone might be interested in. They were seamstresses, and some of the captains and the officers always, had their wives with them. But a lot of the women from the local areas that were their husbands were soldiers. They were nearby or worked there as well. Well, what do we do now? Are we done?
I think
Thank
we
you.
are. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate you guys coming out. I'm willing to stay and answer any more questions, and otherwise, I think I'm going. Are we done?
Yeah, we're done.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I appreciate you guys having me. Y'all have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.